So today we have Beth Baunoch joining us. She's the executive producer of Good School Podcast and also faculty member at CCBC. Thanks for joining us, Beth.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We are thrilled to have you. I think I've mentioned it previously that I've been following Good School Podcast for 2 years now. It was featured in, I think, Inside Higher Ed. I was thrilled to hear that students were taking on the perception of community colleges. So tell me a little bit about, what brings you to CCBC and particularly Good School Podcast?
Yeah, so I've been teaching at CCBC for about 12 years now. I actually moved from the Chicago land area out here to teach full time, and I've been working with students from the beginning, creating media, mostly film to start with, but then over the past probably 5 or 6 years, we've really gotten into podcasting. Students love to make podcasts. I love podcasts. I love to listen to them. I'm a documentary filmmaker, so sort of this shift over into podcasts and doing audio documentaries really appeals to me.
What kind of sparked the interest in creating a podcast specifically of this nature?
So I wrote for this grant from the ACLS to create a podcast production house in Baltimore to bring more inclusivity into the podcast space. Because one of the things I teach a lot about is inclusivity and representation in the media. And so we know that it's lacking majorly in the traditional media, film, radio, TV, et cetera. But podcasting, it seemed like a place that wouldn't happen, but it has happened. When you go onto like Apple Podcasts, you see like the podcasts that come up right away or the ones that are in your face are not very diverse and are not representative of the world that we live in. So that was what I wrote my grant proposal, and I received the grant. And so then I had money to really do something great with the students, because even though like people don't think podcasts cost money, production, but it does. And being able to have that little bit of money helped really get me started. So I put together a crew. Well, I didn't actually put together a crew. I put out a call for students throughout the campus to join a podcast production crew, and students had to apply to it. And we had a lot of students apply, a lot of interest. And I started with 12 students. And the idea was to teach them how to create a podcast while we actually created the podcast. And just real quick, I want to say, in terms of our style of podcast, it is an investigative, more like audio documentary series. So it's very involved in terms of research, interviewing, writing the story, editing, sound design, all of that. It was a huge project to take on, but students were game, and so we got started. But in terms of it being this topic, it was just I wanted the idea of our podcast to come from the students. I wanted them to be invested in it, and I thought if I give them a topic, maybe there's not going to be as much buy-in. So I wanted it to come from them. And one of our nights of brainstorming, we started talking about higher education, and one of the students said something like, my friend goes to a good school. And then that sparked this great conversation about what is a good school. Do people know what they're saying when they say that? Why do we feel like CCBC is not a good school? And so that night we knew what our topic was going to be, and we also knew what our title was going to be: good school, period. It was too perfect.
Absolutely, definitely. I will say, as I've listened to all the sessions or the podcasts, it was not necessarily the content that I expected at first in all of the great ways, right? And I was talking with your students about it because it really kind of took me a little bit like I was like, I love the perspective that it's coming from the students. They don't shy away from the hard questions, the hard topics, making sure that their voice is heard. And that really just, it surprised me, but I was so proud of that. I feel like it takes fostering of that conversation. Is that something that you worked on with them, or how did that
Yeah. Yeah.
boisterous celebration come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, like I said, we've been doing this for so long, so lots of conversations. lots and lots of conversations, trying to get the students to really dig deep, right? I mean, I think it's so easy. I will say, like, we didn't go into this, or the students didn't go into it really understanding what we were going to dig into. What they knew is that there was something wrong, because why did they feel bad about going to CCBC, right? So that's where it started. And then it did take a lot of time and sort of asking them questions, trying to get them to see things in different ways and really dig deep, and lots of research. And also, I think them talking to the experts really helped, when they did their interviews and conversations that, I brought in journalists for them to talk to whose beat is higher ed, to talk about things. And it just, like, over a year and a half, I think it really, um, like light bulbs started coming up. Like, oh wow, like this is what's going on. And I didn't want them to shy away from things. Like we like with every interview that we had, I mean, they were very well researched. We went through every single question. We knew what we were going to ask, in what order, and who was going to ask what, and how to follow up. Like, so much preparation. So this is I guess I'm just trying to say it was a lot of work, a lot of talking, a lot of research, a lot of thinking, a lot of brainstorming, and then also a lot of editing, as well, the writing.
Which I think for a great podcast to come off as easy as it does, it's so conversational, it's engaging, but there's a sense of comfort that they've created with the podcast that I felt very comfortable with them. We were just having a conversation between old friends, and I think that for those that have done a podcast, I will say to get that feeling from it does take so much work behind the scenes that folks just don't realize it. So I definitely applaud you and your students just for being able to do so successfully. And when you started this journey, you wanted to make an impact, but it wasn't maybe to the size or the expectation that it now has reached. What was those initial conversations? Who is the target audience that you wanted to reach? Obviously, Good School was at the forefront, but what was the overarching goal of the podcast itself?
Yeah, of this. So I will say first off, yeah, like, I want this to be big. I told the students from the very beginning, I'm not playing around. This needs to be like what we're doing right here together as a crew is so important that we need a big audience. It's just, and so yeah, so from the very beginning, I wanted it to be huge. And I told them that I'm like, this is gonna be huge. And you know, um, and I did want it to have a really big impact. I think that, to me, one of the biggest goals of this project, and even before I knew what the topic was going to be, I realized whatever topic these students come up with, it's so important because the voice of community college students is not in the world. And it is unfortunate because, 41% of undergraduates in the United States do attend community colleges. So we're talking about a huge part of our culture that is not being heard, that we have no idea what they're thinking or what their perspective is, because what we are hearing, the big journalists or the big podcasts are people who graduated from schools like Northwestern or Columbia, and that's great and that's fine, but and they might be trying to cover community colleges, because I do feel like there has been a little push lately to talk about community college and the importance of it, but it's not coming from our voices.
I think it is so important. I mean, it's such a high percentage will attend a community college, and yet the perception still is out there that it is less than, or that students don't deserve the celebration that a 4-year going student is going to get, right? Like, oh, I got into my first choice school. You get the celebratory admissions packet, the posting on social media. Where do you think the perception of community colleges, particularly the negative perception, comes from?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, like I was saying, like, so, like, if 41% of undergrads in the US go to community colleges, well, we're saying that half of the people in the US aren't good enough, right? And even more, I saw a stat today that said 49% of students who earned their 4-year degree started at a community college. So we really are talking about half of the people who go to higher ed in the United States that we think are not good enough. Where it originated exactly, I don't 100% know, but I do know that it is in pop culture. Community college is the butt of all the jokes, always. And that's a problem. I do think it stems from the whole like ranking system that we do go into. And I think it's episode 3. Like people only know about the Ivy League,
Yep.
right? Not that they only know about it, but those are the school. If you go there, you're a god, like you must be amazing. And you know, that's part of one of the points of this podcast is to sort of pull back the curtain on that. And that's not true, right? And let's talk about why certain people get admitted into the Ivy Leagues and why and how, right? And how most people cannot do that. So, I mean, we did talk about in the history episode because back, early on, community college was called the junior college. And we did talk about the reason why they were actually developed was to keep um, people out of the more prestigious institutions, right? So we'll give you higher ed, you can go to school, but you have to go here. You have to go to junior college. You're not going to make it in the quote, like real college, which is what they call it, right? Like they think of community college as not being real college. So it's just this perception that we have, and it's unfortunate because so many people go, and it makes them feel bad that that's where they're going.
It does, and it's funny when talking with your students. Something that it just kind of blew me away is that I believe it was Liv and Keith had mentioned that they hadn't heard that perception until they actually were already there and they're enrolled, but it made them second guess the decisions that they'd made. And I'm like, it's so they were having great experiences. Everything was going well for them, but because an external perception, it made them rethink. And I was like, that is so unfortunate that they would experience that when the true experience that they're having is anything but. And probably I would go out on a limb and say they probably have had a better experience. And especially in conjunction with the podcast, they're not probably going to get that same experience at a traditional 4-year institution. The hands-on, they talked about faculty members, mentioned them by first name. I mean, there's some schools out there, some 4 years that do that, but that's a rarity, especially at our state institutions.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I do want to say about that is, especially with this experience of the podcast, I only know of one other school that is doing something similar to what we're doing. And what I mean by that is the like investigative, more journalistic audio documentary style. And it's the University of Texas. So they have a podcast production, or they call it an audio production house called The Drag. And they do have that, right? But they also have $1 million, and they have juniors and seniors who are journalism majors. So they would not have gotten this experience somewhere else, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And, it is true. It is true. Like faculty at CCBC, and I would guess in many other community colleges, really get to know their students more, do work with them more one-on-one. The difference though is that when you go to a quote like good school, you do have more doors open to you. So in that way, like it's more about going to a school where you can network, right? And some PhD, right, who has published, right, like so many articles or done so many studies, like that is also part of it. And at a community college, which is a teaching institution, we don't do that because our focus is we teach so many classes that we don't have the funding to do these types of projects, right? So this project that I'm doing, I didn't get paid to do this project. And so I'm just saying, like, that's why, I think some people think that a 4-year is a good school.
Or,
I
think
yeah.
that hopefully through conversations like this and podcasts like Good School is that there's value in everything, right? There's value in the 4-year education. There's value in community college. Some students aren't ready to immediately jump into an education after high school, and that's okay too. They
Yeah.
can find their journey, and I think that that's one thing that I'm so impressed with the podcast. And I will have to say too, going back to the rankings episode, probably one of my favorites. Um, I was talking with the students and I was like, y'all threw some shade into that. I was like, we edited on, I was like, whoa, it's a little salty. But I'm so proud that they are using their voice to again have those hard conversations, to say the tough things and
Yeah.
to question the validity of even a ranking system that's been around since the early 80s. Um, and it's a great episode. I highly encourage really all the podcasts, of course, but that episode really, you want to hear some hard hitting questions and not letting easy answers go by. It was super impressive.
It's true, like, I do have to say, so that it was pretty hard hitting, so, Liv actually interviewed Dr. Freeland, Dr. Richard Freeland. I don't think he's listened to it yet. I don't know that he realizes, how it took shape after the interview, and it wasn't like we had a plan, right, of how of what the shape would be, but we did want to dig into what he did in the '90s and why he did it to try to get Northeastern, to break the top 100. And I get it because it's a business, right? And the ranking system is marketing, it's publicity. But we could not just, sit back and just tell the story without adding, like, that's part of sharing, the community college students' voices. And at the end, we did go back and forth on that last line. Well, let's see your students' podcast. It's a very mic drop moment, but I think it had to go in because, like we were saying, community colleges always are the butt of the joke. Always, always. So come on, like, let's just let's just add a little bit of strength in there, right? So yeah, I have no problem with it, and I love it actually.
I do too. I do too. And I even, in his interview, I mean, he makes some statements in there that we all knew, right? And I'll use one as an example of it's a pay to play game. And,
Yes.
I mean, those are his words exactly. And
Yeah.
it is,
Yeah.
if you want to be a part of it, you have to put the funding into it. And in itself, that's a whole nother podcast conversation about the inequality that comes along with that. Uh, but it's good to hear folks call it what it is. And I was just really super moved by the fact that it does address such a hot topic, and it is something that is very prevalent in today's conversation. Folks are leaving rankings. Um, and so it's interesting to see. So obviously part of Good School is to change the perception of community colleges. But as I was listening to the podcast, I asked, I was like, was it intentional or was it a byproduct that you were also changing the perception of students that attend community colleges? I was like, because the level to which the podcast is interviewing, the content, the research, everything that you've done has a statement on the type of student that they are. Was that intentional for you?
Yeah. So yeah, 100%. So actually, like, the point of the podcast itself, the stories that we told were not supposed to be specific to digging into community colleges or community college students. And I do remember when Inside Higher Ed wrote that article about changing perceptions, and I was like, "Oh, it's not exactly like the goal of the podcast. The goal of the podcast is to investigate higher education, right? And dig into all of these topics that are controversial and that people don't understand and why they feel the way they do about institutions and why admissions is so complicated and like the big business and corruptness and et cetera, et cetera." But by showing this level of student work and the professionalism, that is what can change the perception of community colleges and community college students.
I just think is absolutely brilliant and just a real true testament to the type of students that our community colleges are serving.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And look, just to add to that too, like, community college students are busy. It's not a traditional, like, I mean, I was a traditional 4-year, college student, and my life, so, I had to work and whatever, but my life was being at school. It's not the same for community college students. So anything they do above and beyond the classroom is major. I mean, the commitment that they made to this was huge, right? Because they almost all have families that they're helping to take care of or support in one way or the other. Many are working full time and going to school full time. And like they were part of this crew because they really wanted to be part of this crew. So doing any kind of extracurricular, I mean, it's just very, very difficult for most community college students.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. It's evident that they are incredibly proud of the work that they do, and they should be. I mean, it really is just absolutely amazing. I can't sing the praises of it more. So we have a incredibly successful first season. So tell me, what is next? What's on the books?
I mean, I know that there are students who want to be involved and start a season two. I would love to start a season two, but season one was funded and season two is not yet funded. So we have to see. I mean, I just, I'm a community college professor. I teach 7 classes. So all of this is, I loved every minute of it, but it was a lot of work. So if we can get funding, I would love to do a season two. But again, like I said, I think a lot of people don't understand what all is put into a project like this and what it all entails. So I would love to. I did, my grant was to create a podcast production house in Baltimore, and that's what I did. And, this is our first major podcast, coming out of it. So I do hope to continue. I mean, there's so many more topics to dig into. Like I know the students, we want to get into the college board. We want to get into like athletics, the NCAA. I mean, there's so many more topics to be covered.
I think that's definitely something. Let's get the word out, because I agree. I think that this has just been such an amazing opportunity for students. Once you hear, I think, the podcast where we talk with your students, it'll be blatantly obvious that we need to find funding for y'all, because it really is amazing work, and the talent to see the students finding their way in this world. I think I mentioned to you previously that we all go into higher education, or most of us go into higher education for the true student at the heart of it. And there's nothing more joyous, exciting, pride that seeing your students find who they are, finding their voice, and then using that voice for good.
On top of that, like that's all great stuff. But if we could also talk about the real tangibles, like these students are able to put on their resumes that they were producers on this podcast. So the actual real world skills of working in the media industry and working in journalism, they have begun. Most college students, let alone, community college students and, year 1 and 2, don't have those kind of credits to their name, right? And even mostly juniors and seniors might have an internship credits. These students are producers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know that we spoke with Keith, and he just accepted an internship with his local news channel, I believe.
Yeah.
And he's going in already with skills to be able to rock and roll day one.
Yeah.
Like you said, that's amazing and such a rarity. Well, Beth, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Congratulations on Good School Podcast. You're really setting an area for your students' voices to be heard, and that's truly commendable.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us and for finding us and for following us over the past couple of years and for reaching out. I love to talk about this because it is so important.